So for the past years, I've been getting more and more into astrophotography. It started off with just going out in the middle of the night, figuring out where the Milky Way is, taking a picture, going home, editing it, so on and so forth. Eventually, of course, I learned more about, your environment. You got to know your time of the month, time of the year, even where you live, light pollution, and of course, there's the whole side of equipment to it, right? You can't just go out there with anything. Started learning more about that. And over the past years, I've been trying to find a lens that I can use for astrophotography. That's a very good lens, and that's also versatile enough to allow me to use it for things like landscape photography, cityscapes, and so on and so forth. And you know what? I think I may have found just that lens. I've got a Sigma here, a Sigma 14 24mm lens, aperture f2.8. This is a wide angle lens. This is the DG, which means it's full frame lens. HSM, which means hypersonic motor, which is just very smooth focusing, very quiet and quick focusing. And it's Sigma's Art Series lenses. Art Series lenses typically cost a little more, relatively speaking, with other Sigma lenses. However, they're always going to be made in Japan. And they're more or less, in my opinion, they're flagship lenses, right? Kind of like Canon's L series lenses. Well, Sigma's Art series lenses are exactly that. And being a Canon shooter, I've always been reluctant going out to other brands, but I kept hearing good things about Sigma and thought, you know what, I'll give it a try. Got this guy here, and you know what? First impression, it is a large lens. It's very heavy. If you're using the mirrorless camera like the EOS-R or any other camera type that's mirrorless with this adapter, or mount I mean, you're definitely going to realize that this thing is huge. It dwarfs your camera body. However, there's a reason for this. I've used prime lenses such as the 14mm, Canon 16 to 35mm lenses, all very great, all super expensive. But this lens has an aperture of 2.8 throughout the spectrum, from 14mm to 24. That's why it's so big, in my opinion at least. To accompany the wide aperture at both focal ranges, you have to have the diameter, right? The room for it. But anyway, enough about that. Point is, I think I've found a really great lens, and I want to show you guys why I think so. I would definitely recommend this to those of you who are looking for a lens that, one, can create very high definition shots, meaning that your lens will not be the bottleneck of the quality of your photos. Your sensor will, and of course, your talent. Two, this is a versatile lens because it does allow you some zoom. And another cool thing about this lens that I didn't see on a handful of other Sigma lenses is it's actually sort of dust resistant and weather sealed. It has a rubber seal around the mount. It doesn't mean that it's waterproof, doesn't mean you can go diving with it, but it's definitely good to know when you're out there and it starts snowing or maybe drizzling rain or something like that. Very good to have. Another thing is with most of ultra wide angle lenses, usually the element of the glass that is exterior is a sort of a fisheye design. And because of that, typically you cannot put filters on such lenses, at least not the thread-on filters. However, Sigma has designed a filter for this lens. It's actually a filter holder that goes on the back, and you're able to use filters with it, which is pretty cool in my opinion, especially if you're doing some sort of landscape photography that requires either ND filters or maybe you're doing time lapses or long exposure. So anyway, in this video, I want to go over various environments that I've had this lens in, some of the results I've gotten out of it, and of course you've heard my opinion. I think it's a great lens. So let's go ahead and get into it. To begin with, I wanted to see if this lens suffered from chromatic aberration. Previously with other wide-angle lenses, especially rather cheaper ones, I found that they might be very sharp or they might be good at something else, but they tend to suffer from some kind of chromatic aberration. Not always, but sometimes. And first of all, what is chromatic aberration? Well, as light travels through your lens, because of your lens having all these different elements of glass in it, the light rays actually get split, they get bounced around and diffracted. And ultimately they do bounce back together in a certain point where your focus is. Well, because of just the way the glass is made in general, you can't always have a perfect connection of all of your light rays. So because of that, out of your light spectrum, some colors tend to not align correctly, and thus you see them on your image. So like say your subject is this thing here, or better yet, this here. This is a white object in front of a very, very bright background. And typically you would actually see chromatic aberration on the edges, usually in a green or purple color. But you know what, with this lens, I'm not really seeing any of it. Just to double check, I went ahead and went inside the camera body and turned off chromatic aberration correction, because most camera bodies have that capability now. And even with that off, I could not get chromatic aberration to show up anywhere. Which is really neat and a very cool thing. And you know, in general, I would say this, that chromatic aberration doesn't really bother people until they notice it, or until somebody tells them about it. And then they start seeing it everywhere, and it's just kind of annoying, especially when you remove it. And in the removal process, it takes away sharpness, because usually it shows up around the edges of your subject, thus removing the sharpness or the definition of that thing or whatever that you are taking a picture of. So I guess to remove the chromatic aberration, or at least minimize it, Sigma has been using something called FLD glass, which I guess is just F low dispersion glass. It's supposed to be a substitute to fluorite glass, and in case you didn't know, fluorite glass has been used for many, many years to minimize diffraction and improve the quality of an image, or even in glasses. But however, it is unfortunately, even though it's been going on for so long, it's still incredibly expensive and difficult to manufacture. So I guess Sigma found a way to substitute it with something else called FLD glass that is cheaper to manufacture, but still apparently gets the exact same results. So again, very neat. Next, I wanted to look at the vignetting of the lens. You know, typically lenses, when you open them up all the way, you know, as wide as they can go, you get some vignetting around the corners. Whether it's, you know, the darker vignette, the loss of light, or the loss of sharpness around the edges, as you can kind of see here. So I have the lens open all the way at f2.8, and you can definitely tell, you know, the center of the image is a lot brighter than the outside of it. And to further prove my point, I'm going to go to the next image where my aperture is at 5.6 and immediately becomes brighter. The edges are a lot brighter now, the vignetting is minimized. There's still a little bit of loss of sharpness around the edges, but that is quite normal. It's still doing a very good job in terms of sharpness everywhere else. And to prove my point further, I'm going to go to f22, as tight as the aperture can go. And now you basically have no vignetting at all. And it's actually very sharp everywhere, meaning that your depth of focus is a lot deeper now, so more things are in focus. The next thing I wanted to look at, out of curiosity, was sunstars. And I'm not quite sure what the correct term for this is, but you know, when you see a really cool image of a landscape and the sun peeks through something and it creates these beautiful stars, well, typically there's a recipe for that, and that is, you know, tightening up your aperture. And in my experience, what works well is when your source of light, or maybe the sun, or whatever it might be, it is sort of blocked by some object halfway, and it forces your light to turn into these sun stars. And so, just for comparison purposes, I have the aperture open all the way, and as you can see, the light is just a kind of a blur, right? I'll move over to f11, sort of the halfway point of the aperture capability. You immediately start seeing these little light rays come out. And even more at aperture f22, you get this beautiful bouquet of sunstar. And typically, the amount of these lines you get will depend on your aperture blades. In this case, the Sigma has 9 rounded aperture blades, and because of its, I'm not quite sure why, but odd number amount of diaphragm blades create twice as much lines coming out of the star as the number of blades. So in this case, if this were like a 6-bladed aperture, you would actually see only 6 lines. But most newer lenses out there have an odd number of blades. Next, I wanted to take a look at the distortion, sort of the barrel distortion you get from wide-angle lenses. I know with some lenses that I've reviewed in the past, especially like Canon, though they are very sharp and affordable, they suffer a lot from distortion. And it's hard to avoid that when you're going, you know, something at like 14mm wide angle. But Sigma has done a very good job. Now this is actually zoomed in all the way at 24mm, and you can almost not notice any distortion, although if you do look at that outer plank, you will notice it's slightly curved, but the center is pretty straight. However, if we zoom out all the way at 14 millimeters, you start seeing a lot more barrel distortion. And it's not enough to compromise your image, but it's some, and I'm actually quite amazed at the performance, because other lenses I've used at 14 millimeters have a lot worse distortion. And to make it a little bit easier to see, I have a picture of this window here, and you can see the panels here kind of curved outwards around, but still kind of in control in the middle. Finally, one last thing I wanted to mention is sometimes what happens with wide-angle lenses is the outskirts of the image get this sort of coma distortion, sort of a stretched image. And as you can see here, I'm going to zoom in on this photo, what's happening to these stars in the outside corner of the image, they're getting stretched out. This image was actually, as you can see, taken on a Canon EF 20mm lens, and it suffered a lot from not only that, but a couple of other issues. Now here's an example of another Canon lens that is a lot more expensive than that 20mm lens I just showed you. This is Canon's prime 14mm lens. Very cool lens, very expensive. As you can see, it does have that same thing going on the outsides. It's not horrible. Well, actually, it kind of is horrible. If I could, I would crop out some of it, but generally, people who are going to be looking at your photo are going to be fixated on whatever you're actually taking a picture of, so usually won't be an issue. But, you know, people like me who like to pixel pick notice stuff like that. And finally, here is the Sigma 14-24mm lens that I'm reviewing. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom in sort of at the outskirts of the image. I'm seeing a lot less of that going on the outer edges than I did on the Canon lenses. The left side looks a little bit worse, like right here, but that also does include a little bit of the fact that, you know, as you're taking a very long exposure shot, there is some movement in the sky as the Earth is rotating. Again, very, very well impressed with this lens. So my hope is that you were able to get a decent idea of the capabilities of this lens. Hopefully the examples I have and the results that I've gotten portray a pretty good picture for you. And you know, at the end of the day, we can't have every single lens in the world. There are so many lenses out there, there's so many manufacturers out there, and there are so many types of photography out there. Whatever your favorite style is, you know, the nicest thing is when you can find a lens that can do either all or at least most of it. In my opinion, I think I've actually found the lens. I can do almost all of my favorite kind of photography with one lens, and for me that is huge. So again, I hope everybody enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you guys next time.